Hello, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Pete. I'm a behavioral scientist, and today's video I'm so excited because we're doing a series that I've wanted to do ever since I started this channel, which is taking my subscribers' behavioral challenges and offering some free behavioral science-based advice. So that's what we're doing today. 3 different subscribers have sent in their challenges. I'm going to read them, and then I'm going to explain what I would do based off my knowledge of behavioral science. As always, this is free advice. My clients are free to take it or leave it. They don't have to do anything or everything that I say here. It is totally up to them, but this is just what I would do as a behavioral scientist. Okay, so our first client is Callum, and he runs a charity called Sporting Wellness. Here's what he said on the video.
Hey Pete, my name's Callum and I'm the founder of a mental health charity called Sporting Wellness. We provide free private mental health care to any athlete in the UK aged over 16, and our biggest challenge is trying to make athletes realise that they don't have to be a professional sports person to access our services.
In addition to that video, Callum also sent me an email with a bit more context. So he said, "We are the first charity that provides free private mental health care to any athlete in the UK, the first organisation to do so. Our big mission is to create a quality of access to professional mental health care in sport as the best form of intervention in formal medical healthcare." Very noble cause, love it. He said the charity was started after his own experience as a cricketer, when he was denied access to professional mental health services on the ground that he wasn't a contracted professional. When looking deeper, he realized that there's a situation in the UK where only the very elite of athletes and a very small number of them were able to access professional services simply because the model was pay as you go, which made it very costly, which means it's just not accessible to most people. So he said we had a situation where a very small number of athletes got a very high standard of support and everyone else got nothing. That was his inspiration for the charity. He explains a little bit more about his business model and how the charity is able to provide mental health care for free. And like he said in his video, his main challenge is getting athletes who are not professionals to realize that they can also have access to this support. So here's what I would do. So let's start by looking at the Sporting Wellness website, because I think there's a lot you can do with website design in order to incorporate behavioral science principles and guide the customer. I don't know if customer is the right word to use here because you're a charity, but guide the customer towards the behavior that you're trying to get them to do. So right off the bat, we see some things that are really good here on the homepage. For example, all of these news organizations that are listed down below, that gives a lot of authority to the charity, and authority is really important in trying to be a persuasive voice. But one thing that jumps out to me straight away about this homepage is that you present the person visiting your website with 2 buttons, and the 2 buttons are kind of given equal weight. You have one that says get support and one that says give monthly, join the huddle. Now, if you want to get someone to engage in a behavior, removing decision points is really powerful. Rather than present your customer with a decision as soon as they go onto your website, instead, why don't you recess one of these buttons? Maybe just put it in the bar at the top. I would put the join the huddle bar at the top there, like, because you already have a button there, and just make get support as a button really big and in the center of the website, because that's really the thing that you want people to do, right? You really want to drive people towards pushing that button. So make it really big, really obvious. In behavioral science, we call this making something salient, right? If you make something salient, it means it stands out from the background and almost acts as like a kind of default, as like this is what you're supposed to do on this website. You're supposed to click this big button. Secondly, when I go on the get support page, I'm presented with a lot of different things that you are able to provide. Professional counseling, an online cognitive behavioral therapy program, support line and chat, legal support. There's a lot of different services that you're able to provide to your customers. However, if I'm your average athlete here in the UK, I might not really know what any of these things are or what they mean for me. And so intuitively, as a behavioral scientist, I would assume that people who are visiting your website are faced with what we call choice overload. There's just too many different things, and it's actually quite ambiguous as to what any of those things really mean for people on a day-to-day basis. So one thing I like to do when I'm working with a client who has a large number of options on their website, but they're not always totally obvious which is the best for the customer, is to take advantage of a quiz. So this is how the quiz would work. As soon as somebody clicks the button in the middle of the screen, they'd be launched into this quiz. And the first question would be something really simple, like, are you aged 16 or over? Because you only provide support to people who are 16 and over. Super easy question. Yes or no, I'm over 16. Second question, have have you suffered from any depression in the last 12 months or any anxiety in the last 12 months, any of these kind of common mental health problems. And basically what you want to be doing is slowly guiding your customer through the journey and breaking down like the requirements for getting support into little digestible chunks. And as a result of that, they're much more likely to go further down that path and therefore engage with you at the very end. And basically the output of this quiz would be a automated recommendation on your part that says, based on your current situation, we recommend having this, and this will help you achieve these different goals. Now, there's lots of different websites that do this. One is Bright Sellers, for example. They're a company that sells wine boxes. Wine is another super complicated industry with lots of different options that most lay people don't know much about. And so the way that they help people discover what wine they would want is by doing a wine quiz at the start of their website. Another company that does this really well is Noom. I don't know if you guys know Noom, but they're a behavioral science-led weight loss company. I'm friends with some of the guys who run it. Noom has a really long quiz at the start of their sign-up process, and they really break down all the different like needs and requirements of that particular client in the beginning. So that would be my number one recommendation for this website, is to add a quiz. And just as an additional consideration, I would also reconsider the word athlete. So to me, athlete means professional. I know that strictly speaking, in terms of the Oxford Dictionary definition, it doesn't necessarily mean a professional person, but I think most people have this sort of semantic, this sort of connotation that athlete means sort of professional, contracted athlete. And so if you want to appeal to people who aren't contracted athletes, I would maybe consider rejigging that name to maybe like sports person or something that doesn't sound like it's so closely associated with being a contracted professional. So the next one is from Phil. Let's take a look.
Hi Pete, it's Phil here from Nudge Podcast, and yeah, I'd like your help. I host Nudge, which is a podcast all about behavioral science, and I would love your tips to help me get more people to listen to the podcast. Anything you can think of to increase awareness, make people more likely to listen, perhaps make them subscribe as well, that would be fantastic. Cheers.
So that's Phil. He runs a great podcast called Nudge. I highly recommend it. So hopefully that will push some people over to your podcast. It is a really good podcast. It's genuinely one of my favorite behavioral science podcasts out there. So Phil has a very simple acquisition challenge. And I've done dozens of these acquisition challenges in the past. It's super common. Basically, how do we get more customers? How do we get more subscribers to this particular product or service? So when it comes to a challenge like this, where we're just trying to increase the total number of subscribers or listeners or customers to a particular product or service, people often forget that this is actually a two-sided equation. On the one hand, you have acquisition, which is where people's brains tend to go to immediately, which is how do we get as many new people to listen to this thing as possible? But on the other hand, there's retention, and retention is arguably even more important than acquisition. How do you keep more of those people who listen to one episode to listen to more episodes going forwards? And if you can increase your retention, then your overall repeat viewership or listenership on each episode is going to be a lot higher, and then the acquisition doesn't become so important. So let's start with retention. So when it comes to retention, there's a few different tricks from behavioral science that you can use. So in order to increase the number of listeners who come back for a second episode, I would consider implementing the idea of cliffhangers. So cliffhangers are really powerful because they take advantage of something in our psychology called completion bias. And this is basically a bias where when we feel like we've started something, we work really hard to try and complete it. If you ever watch the TV show Suits, you'll know they do this every single episode. So after you finish one episode, there's this incredibly powerful psychological urge to watch another one because you need to know what happens at the end of that storyline. And so you can do the same thing with podcasts as well. You can do something at the end of your podcast where you open up like a new line of inquiry or a new story that doesn't get resolved until the very next episode. And so by doing that, you're going to encourage people to kind of binge your episodes and go from one to the other to the other to the other. And it's going to make it like a lot more appealing to come back again and again and again. So when it comes to the acquisition side of things, and it's probably advice that I should take myself as well, is that consider advertising in some less conventional places because that's going to help your advertisement stand out. So when it comes to a digital product like a podcast or a YouTube channel, we instinctively think to advertise on digital channels like social media, for example. Or of course, we try and get boosted up on the sort of, podcast homepage of whatever platform we're using. But the problem with that is then your podcast is competing with loads of other podcasts that are vying for that same listener's attention. And it therefore becomes very difficult for your individual podcast to stand out. So one thing that you might want to consider thinking about is advertising in a place where other podcasts aren't advertising, but your target audience is there. For example, your podcast is about behavioral science and marketing. So consider advertising in a place where other marketing people hang about, maybe in a pub near a marketing agency, or maybe in a marketing magazine, for example. By doing so, an advertisement for a podcast in this super unusual place is going to stand out way more than like any of the other advertisements, because it's so unusual to see a podcast advertisement in that place, and therefore people are much more likely to pay attention to it. I learned about this technique from a behavioral science practitioner called Jez Groom. Some of you may know him. He helped to found the team at Ogilvy, and now he runs a team called Cowrie Consulting. So Jez Groom told me one time on a chat that he once did this with a soup product. So they were doing some advertising for a soup brand, and they were mainly targeting kind of older people. And so, you know, if you think about a soup brand traditionally where you'd be advertising, this is like way back in the day, kind of before the internet is as big as it is now, you would think about advertising in kind of food magazines, right? Putting a soup ad in a food magazine where people are looking at other food. But the problem with that is that you're flicking through the magazine and there's food, and your ad for soup is just another food ad in a sea of food ads, so it doesn't stand out. And so what Jez, and I think Rory might have been involved in this campaign as well, so what they did was they thought, well, where are other old people hanging about? Like, where else would they be hanging around and looking at advertisements, and where could we therefore put this ad for soup that targets old people in an unusual place? And that place they thought of was the garden centre. They knew that garden centres were primarily occupied by older members of the population. And so by advertising soup in a garden centre, they found they got a much bigger uplift in sales compared to when they advertised in traditional food-based medium. So that's a nice little case study for you. And I think it's a really interesting idea of advertising in unusual places. And my final bit of advice for you, Phil, is to get on TikTok. If your podcast isn't on TikTok in 2023, like, what are you doing? And this is like common knowledge, I think, for a lot of creators here on the internet, but also it's interesting to talk about from a psychological point of view. Why is putting your podcast on TikTok, on YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels, why is that so important for podcast growth? Well, firstly, because podcasts don't have a very strong sort of discovery algorithm on their own, but it's also important because podcasts are a very long format type of content. And so it's very rare that people are looking for a new podcast. Like, people tend to only listen to kind of a couple of podcasts every year. They're unlikely to like be looking for new podcasts all the time in the same way that people are looking for new TikToks or new YouTube videos. And so by sort of shrinking down sections of your podcast into shorts, into TikToks, into Reels, you allow people to have exposure to your podcast in short amounts on a more regular basis. And by sort of breaking it down into these sort of short bursts, it gets people more familiar with your style, with your talk, with the kind of topics that you talk about. So then next time they are in the market for a new podcast, your podcast will be more what we call mentally available, sort of more present in people's brain, because they have likely just seen a short of you earlier. Whereas if the first time they ever hear about your podcast is when they see it like on the podcast homepage, or they're trying to like look for it on the podcast homepage, that's a very difficult sell because they have no exposure to anything about your podcast in the past. So that's my top advice for you, Phil. And our third subscriber is Nick. So Nick tends to work in public policy during the day, but this is actually a challenge that he has from his personal life. So here's the video.
Hi Pete, my name is Nick and I work for the beautiful and vibrant Dutch city of Utrecht. There's a lot of behavioral challenges in the public domain, yet I'd like to bring one to your attention from my personal life. So here's the thing, if you go out with a group of people, people tend to get rounds of drinks for each other. And in the beginning they ask what you want and if you want something to drink, but after a few rounds, after a couple of drinks, they don't ask anymore. They just go to the bar and get you something, usually just a beer. And I'm not a big fan of beer, but especially at the end of the night, I'm kind of like alcoholically saturated and I don't want anymore. So I guess my challenge is this. Can you think of any way to make it more acceptable in this social environment to either refuse or, even better, to stop them getting rounds for everyone without asking? Well, I'm looking forward to your ideas. Thanks in advance.
So this is a challenge that I actually feel very passionately about. I think that the drinking culture here in Western Europe is absolutely absurd and it's terrible for society. I chose to go completely teetotal, that means no alcohol, for over 2 years now, and it's honestly one of the best decisions I ever made. So let's talk about it. Now, this challenge is interesting because you're trying to shift a social norm. And shifting a social norm, historically in behavioral science, is one of the hardest types of behavioral challenges, because social norms often mean that this is something which are kind of ingrained in people's habits, like you say, is kind of ingrained in the culture of that area, of that society. And so changing those sort of very big societal pressures is quite difficult, but there are some things that you can do. So let's talk about it. So with a challenge like this, the first thing that jumps out to me is that this behavior is happening too quickly. your friends are buying rounds of drinks before they've checked with everybody whether they actually want a new drink, and they're just going out and buying it with very little resistance or friction. And so my first port of call, where my brain first goes in order to try and change this behavior, is to think, where can we add friction into this process in order to slow your friends from buying those drinks straight away, and giving them a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of time to first pause, think, and actually ask you whether you want a new drink or not. Instinctively, in this situation, most people would think, oh, I should try and nudge the friends who are buying the drinks. But influencing them might be very difficult. Instead, where I would go is to try and influence the bartender, the person who is actually the one serving the drinks. Because they're the ones who can be influenced by, for example, their boss, the person who owns that establishment. And if you successfully nudge them, then your nudge therefore carries through to everybody else who then drinks at that particular establishment. So one good way to add friction is to implement cooldowns. So cooldowns are really powerful because what they do is they literally stop people from acting for a minute. So it literally forces them to pause before they act. It's kind of like, when you send an email and you realize, oh no, I forgot to attach that attachment. But thankfully the email has a little cooldown before it's sent, so you can click undo and then reattach your attachment. That's what a cooldown is, right? So can we implement a cooldown into the drinking or bar experience, right? Now, with a physical intervention, it could be the case that, the boss of the bar talks to their bartender and says, if somebody in the bar is coming for a second or third round of drinks, give them a little timer where they have to sort of turn it around, wait for it to get to the bottom, give them a little 60-second timer to give them time to go back to their friends, make sure they've asked everybody if they actually want a drink before they come back and order them. So that could be a physical intervention. And of course, if this is a kind of more modern bar or club where all of this ordering is done through the app, then this is even easier to implement because you can see on the app how many drinks that table has ordered already. And if you can see it, they've already ordered 2 rounds of drinks or 3 rounds of drinks, then you can just implement this cooldown into the software of the app, which therefore would give people that timer to then ask their friends whether they actually want a new drink or not. Now, some of you watching this video might be thinking, Pete, the bar wants to sell as many drinks as possible. Why would they ever do something like this? This is only going to hurt their business. But from my experience working with many different businesses, this is probably not the case. Let me explain why. A lot of the time, brands who have long-term goals of being successful in the long run don't want their customers to overindulge in their product in the short term. And the reason for that is because overindulging in the short term has very poor payoffs in the long run. For example, in the case of drinking alcohol, if you have patrons coming into your bar and they have a terrible experience because they drink loads, they get really hammered, have an awful night, then the likelihood of them coming back to that bar for another night is actually probably reduced. On top of that, the problem with alcohol, of course, is that people who get too drunk become rowdy. Rowdy people are less predictable. They can cause all kinds of problems. They can break things. They can start fights, etc., etc., etc. And so what I often find working with businesses who really care about repeat customers and the longevity of their business, they don't want people to overindulge in the short term. Even if it means sacrificing a little bit of revenue in the short run, they know that in the long run, it'll pay off in dividends. And so I think this is a really good place to start, is talk to the bars, talk to the people who own the establishments, nudge them to change the behavior and add a little bit of friction. Another way that you can try and shift social norms is to do something really visual. Now, changing something visual about the environment is incredibly powerful in psychology because more of our cerebral cortex, that's that outer part of the brain that separates us from the animals, or at least most of us, more of that is dedicated towards vision than any of our other senses. And so if you can change something visual about the environment, it's much more likely to be noticed. So when it comes to shifting the social norm, how can we basically give people a huge badge that says, I don't want any more, without it being literally a huge badge that nobody, of course, would wear? Well, one really good example of how this is done in the wild is a Brazilian steakhouse. So if you've ever been to one of these Brazilian steakhouses or Brazilian buffets, basically the way it works is that you sit at a table and these different servers will come around with these huge skewers of flame roasted meat and they'll carve them at the table for you. And the way that you call them is through the coaster under your drink. And so if you have the coaster set to green, then the people who are walking around with the skewers of meat know that you want more meat. And if you flip it over to red, then they know, okay, I should stop. This person's had enough food. Now, why can't we do something similar with drinking with your mates? Why not every coaster on the table have a green side and a red side? It's literally a traffic light system. People already have that association of go and stop. And it's very kind of subtle and discreet, right? You could just quickly flip it over, and then before anybody goes to order drinks, they can have a 2-second glance at the table, see exactly how many drinks they need to order, and therefore nobody is over ordering. I think that's a really neat solution. It won't stop the flow of conversation. It won't kind of interrupt the norms, and it just sort of establishes a social norm in a very visual way. So I would look to Brazilian steakhouses as a really excellent form of behavioral design. I'm filming this outro a few days later, hence the haircut and the change of outfit, but thank you to Callum, Phil and Nick for sending in your challenges for this first episode. I hope you guys enjoyed watching today's video. If you want to be featured in the next episode of this series, then drop me an email. My email is down below, contactpetejudo@gmail.com. I'd love to hear any behavioral challenges you have, but especially I'd love to hear it if you tell me something about your work, something if you run a small business or you're a charity or you work in public policy. I'd love to hear your challenges if it's related to what you actually do for your work. All right, thank you so much for watching today's video, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.